Hello, my name is James Arroyo, and welcome to Chapter 5 Audience Analysis. As we know, with the transactional model of communication is not just one message. When we do a public speech, yes, there is one message where we send and encode a message for the audience. But there is also a second message, and that is what the audience decodes, and that goes through a lot of the filters of uh, race, gender, socioeconomic status, age, and many other factors that we can account for in our public speech, and therefore have more control over the message that we send, and also to make sure that we do not fall into any traps that could diminish the quality of our speech overall. So let's begin with why is understanding the audience important? What's the point? Well, what are some of the challenges of speaking to an unknown audience? The big one is what can I say? What will make an impact? What won't make an impact? Also, you may fall into some traps of, is there going to be something particularly insulting that I didn't know? Let's watch a short video.
It's their country, and the government ought to reflect their traditions and their history. All we expect is people to be treated with respect, and there to be self-governance in a way that tolerates differences of opinion. Yeah. Peter, are you going to ask that question with those shades on? No, I'm interested in the shade look, seriously.
All right, I'll keep it then.
For the viewers, there's no sun.
I guess it depends on your perspective.
Touche.
Excellent. So as you can see from the top of the video, it says that reporter was indeed blind. First of all, let's get this one out of the way. Did George Bush think that this reporter was blind and it was his intent to insult this blind reporter? Absolutely not. But did it matter in regards to his message getting communicated? Not really. It was a distraction from his message, and therefore the coverage of this press conference wasn't what he was talking about. Instead, it was how he insulted a blind reporter. Also, we want to know some other reasons why we do audience analysis, because we want to know what information should we collect, what information the audience knows or doesn't know, and therefore when we know all that information, then we are able to adapt with this information. And there are ways to do that as well to avoid pandering.
Following up
Let's
on
go ahead and jump on into some useful audience information. We start with age. Age is one that is very easy to use because some references may not land if the age is not accounted for. A good example of this is 9/11. For people around my age, they may, as well as maybe a bit younger, may have a visceral experience of 9/11 because they were a child or a young adult, or that they can actually remember the day of 9/11. But someone a bit younger who didn't live through that or was very, very young at the time, it may not hold as big of an impact. In the same way, it's actually very interesting to note that Watergate, a very important part of our American history, is actually something that very few or not as many people have any sort of real knowledge of these days. We also have gender. We want to be sure that we are being inclusive in regards to gender, so try to avoid the using he when you mean he and she, or Also try to avoid gendered language. Uh, Businessman instead of business person, stewardess instead of flight attendant. The reason why we should make these small changes is because when we have this gendered language, let me take a step back. Language affects our worldview. We see the world through language because we place symbolic meaning on things outside of the world to better understand them. So if we have words like businessman or stewardess, then it makes it so that there is a distinct, that it already places some symbolic meaning on those things and a very gendered meaning for that. Moving on, though, we talk now about religion. Don't assume that you know the audience, the religion of the audience. Even if the whole audience is, let's say, Christian, then are there multiple sects of Christianity that all have different beliefs? Even within one sect of Christianity, are there multiple beliefs within, or a diversity of beliefs within that? So we want to be sure that if we do have to talk about these sorts of things, we should highlight the uniqueness of our beliefs and therefore the beliefs of others. With sexual orientation, be inclusive and avoid any sort of trigger words. Words like homosexual is a derogatory term. The reason why is because it's that was one that actually tripped me up a little bit. I was like, really? But apparently, it's been used by anti-gay groups. It's basically like using the scientific term for someone instead of, and thereby diminishes their humanity. At least that's the way it's been explained to me. And also saying that it is a sexual preference. We want to be sure that we are avoiding that as well because it's not. But there you go. Next, we have racial, ethnic, and cultural background. We are a melting pot. Our diversity is what makes America great, so we want to be inclusive and highlight the uniqueness of other people's beliefs. Also, group memberships. Co-cultures have their own values, beliefs, and behaviors. Co-cultures are group memberships that have certain values, beliefs, and behaviors. So, for example, within the main culture of America, there are co-cultures, Democrat and Republican. In the same way, does football have its own culture? Absolutely. Now let's go to each individual team. Do the Oakland Raiders have a certain values, beliefs, and behaviors? Exactly. They value, excellence. They believe that winning's important, and their behavior is winning all the time. Even though if you watch the games, that may be not exactly true. Whereas if you have the New England Patriots, their values are, winning games maybe, beliefs is that cheating is okay, and they behave in that sort of way. Anyway, so now let's move on to socioeconomic status. What qualifies as rich, be it in California or Nevada or even New York City? This can change across geography, so that's something to keep in mind. But it is also something to keep in mind because people in different socioeconomic statuses also have some of the same things that are relevant to them. For people of higher socioeconomic status, home ownership may be something that is highly valuable. Whereas within lower socioeconomic statuses, that may not be as relevant or useful in that situation. And the very last thing, and this is kind of a coverall, homogeneity. This is the sameness within the audience. So for example, in a class of, maybe a college class of people going right from high school to college, there may be a lot of homogeneity, a lot of sameness of each of those types of students. Whereas with a community college, there may be not as much homogeneity. There may be different ages and genders and religions and sexual orientations and racial, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds beyond that of a college where students go right from high school to college. I like to think of this as a benefit because this allows for us to have a diversity of ideas versus just what people just coming out of high school, what are the things on their mind? So, how much should we rely on this information? That is a very good question, and it does matter. It is based on whether or not the information, it depends on the topic, and it also depends on who you are. And lastly, it also depends on it depends on those two big things. Let's go ahead and jump on in.
I want to win this election so darn badly that I am willing to do this.
That's House Speaker Paul Ryan waving the terrible towel, a Pittsburgh Steelers tradition, while talking to the Pennsylvania delegation at the Republican National Convention. The only problem is that the RNC is in Cleveland, home of the Steelers' rivals, the Cleveland Browns. Ryan was blasted on Twitter for disrespecting the host city, joining a long list of politicians who have tried to pander using sports only to strike out with voters. During his 2004 presidential campaign, John Kerry seriously hurt his chances in Wisconsin by flubbing the name of the Green Bay Packers' famous stadium, calling it Lambert Field instead of Lambeau Field. Carly Fiorina was so desperate to drum up support ahead of this year's Iowa Republican caucus that she said she would cheer for the University of Iowa over her alma mater Stanford in the 2016 Rose Bowl. It didn't work. The Hawkeyes got crushed 45-16, and Fiorina got less than 2% of the vote. Maybe the most embarrassing instance of pandering gone wrong is Ted Cruz seeming to forget basic basketball terminology altogether in Indiana.
You know, the amazing thing is that basketball ring.
And his supporters didn't look happy about it. Even successful campaigns aren't immune. Donald Trump said he was worried about attendance at a California rally because San Francisco was playing in the NBA Finals. The Golden State Warriors left San Francisco for Oakland in 1971. Hillary Clinton hasn't had much to say about athletics this campaign, but she's no stranger to controversy over her sports loyalties.
Well, now, the fact is, I've always been a Yankees fan.
I thought you were a Cubs fan.
I am. I am a Cubs fan. But I needed an American League team.
For Newsy, I'm Grant Sunison.
So, the point of this video is to show that if we rely too heavily on demographic information, as well as focus on culture-specific references, it can very much lead into pandering. What do I mean by culture-specific references? What I mean by this is something like waving the terrible towel, or, saying things that are not authentic. Those would be very more culture specific, like focusing on one particular culture instead of using examples from multiple cultures. That may be a better option because you are not leaving people out. No audience will ever be completely homogeneous. So it is good to understand that we should always find ways to have examples from multiple different multiple parts of your audience.
I want to win.
Now we move on to some more useful audience information. First of all, thinking about what your relationship to the audience is. So think about the audience's previous knowledge of the topic. Do they understand the audience? Do they understand the topic? Or do they not understand the topic at all? If I'm teaching math to a bunch of first graders, I may start with addition, subtraction. Versus if I was talking to college students, that may not be the best way to start, because if everyone already knows that information, why am I talking about it? And it can lead to the audience losing interest. The second part is ego involvement. This focuses in social judgment theory. The general idea behind this is that if the audience already has an anchor point, this is more focused in persuasion. Let's say that I am trying to persuade that pineapple belongs on pizza, and you believe, rightfully so, that pineapple has no place on pizza. So, your anchor point is to the negative. There is another component to this. If I say that if you care a lot or if you care a little, then the latitude either increases if you care a lot or decreases if you care very little. So let's put this into perspective. If I am trying to persuade you that pineapple belongs on pizza and you do not care whether or not pineapple belongs on pizza or not, but you kind of don't think that it should, then you would have a very low latitude of rejection, whereby you will reject on the face a majority of what I'm going to say, but only very little. Whereas if you care a lot, then you would have a very high latitude of rejection. This means that the majority of what I'm going to say, you are going to reject outright. Whereas if someone agrees with me and cares a lot, they will have a very high latitude of acceptance. Whereas if they care very little, they may have a low latitude of acceptance. Yeah, sure, they'll agree with me sometimes, but they really won't care either way. If they don't care at all and don't have any position, then there's just non-commitment there. We use this idea in what information we are presenting, because if the audience, let's say, agrees with me fully and cares a lot, then my goal is not to change your ideas. In fact, it is to make you more motivated to act on those behaviors. And I do not need to prove each and every one of my points. I can instead support my points and then move on. Versus if there is a very high latitude of rejection of what I'm going to say, then I have to prove each and every one of my points. But even more so, I need to find areas where we both agree and then use that to get into things that we may not agree with as much. So let's think about this though in audience. Who is the best out of all these four? Top left being Neil deGrasse Tyson, top right being Elon Musk, left being, I believe, Khloe Kardashian, and on the bottom right, that it would be Michael Jordan. Who is the smartest? Who is the kindest? Who is the most attractive? Who is the most personable? Each and every one of these would depend on who you identify with most, and that is very much the point. Ethos, credibility is based on the audience's perceptions. So if someone cares a lot about basketball and not about much else, or doesn't care about other things as much, then they may say that Michael Jordan is the smartest and the most personable. Maybe most attractive, but I don't know. So the reason for that is because there is identification surrounding that. Plus, smart. You have to be smart to read basketball plays and to read defenses and to know when to drive and when to shoot. So there is a lot going on. But each and every one of these could change based on your own worldview. Now let's talk about the environment, because the environment can affect the speech as well. Situational factors matter. The size shows you how formal the speech should be. Because if more people show up, then by very virtue of that fact, the message is more important, and therefore you should act more formally instead of diminishing the importance of the situation. Also, focus on how the audience is dressed. If the audience is dressed somewhat casually, you want to dress up slightly casually, but a little bit nice. The general rule of thumb is that you should always dress up slightly better than the audience. Focus on seating arrangement as well, and then the location from the audience to the speaker. If you are speaking to an audience like this, that may change your delivery style. In fact, usually I don't have my hands way up here, but I need to use them because I like to gesticulate and talk with my hands sometimes. Also, but if it was in a auditorium, I'd have to speak louder. If it was people around me, then I'd have to talk to some part of the audience, then I'd have to turn around and talk to another part of the audience, and continue to find ways to do that throughout the speech. Also, keep in mind, will microphones be available? Because that will change the way you deliver as well. Also, keep in mind recent events. How can recent events change your speech? There have been a lot of movies that have either cut out certain parts or have changed their or weighted based on active shooters. One in particular, there was like a movie of like of a shootout in a movie theater, and this was right before, and it was about to be released as right as the person who thought he was the Joker apparently did what he did. So we want to be sure that we are keeping in mind of recent events so that we do not diminish the overall impact of our speech. Also, we overcome this obstacle by understanding it and finding ways to avoid triggering the audience. Now we move on to why is the audience there? There are two types of audience. There are captive audiences and there are volunteer audiences. Captive audiences, the attendance is mandatory where you are forced to be here. Whereas volunteer audiences, attendance is optional. You chose to be here. How do we adapt? In this classroom, are we a captive audience or a hostile or a volunteer audience? Of course, we are a volunteer audience because you chose to be in this class. Probably not. In fact, you know what? This is a general education requirement, not to mention, it's a general education requirement. So you do have to be here. But you adapt to this message by trying to be as engaging as possible, by trying to find relevant examples, and by making it overall more digestible than you normally would, versus a volunteer audience. In a volunteer audience, you may be able to go in more depth on certain things because the audience may already have a previous knowledge of the topic. Also, you may be able to you may not have to spend as much time engaging the audience and instead just focusing on what you're talking about because the audience is already engaged. It is already relevant to them or else they would not have come. Now let's talk about the audience's expectations of content and quality. We start with quality. There is a certain level of preparation and a level of delivery skills that are expected across different speaking situations. For a classroom environment like this, the preparation level is consistent. It should be fairly high. That I will always say is the expectation. But the level of delivery skills, that may be lower at the start because it is understandable that we are not at that level yet. But by the end, that expectation that the audience has will be higher, obviously. Then we move on to content expectations. With a speech about how to take great pictures, what are some of the content expectations? It may be aperture, it may be lighting, it may be zoom, it may be all these things. So if I instead am talking about how to generate in the computer the best image, the expectations may not be met. I'm like, well, I don't even know how to take the picture, and now you're talking to me about what I do after I take the picture? There is also a length expectation. The length expectation, I mean, if I were to keep you 20 minutes late from a 3-hour class, then, of course, that would defy your expectation. There have also been a lot of other situations like this. A good example for those people who like video games out there, but a few years ago, I believe, at BlizzardCon, it's a video game convention, the audience was expecting to hear about a particular video game, Diablo 3. And then at the very end of the video game conference, they said, well, there's one last surprise. And the audience is like, okay, let's go for it. And then there was like demon imagery on the screen. And it was like, oh my gosh, here it is. And then they released Diablo Immortal, I believe, which was a mobile game of Diablo. This shattered the audience's expectation to the point where the rest of the entire video game conference was a complete wash. The whole coverage of it was, oh, is this some sort of joke? Are they that out of touch? Do they really care about us? And that shaped the entire conversation surrounding that video game conference. So we have to keep in mind the audience's expectations. Now let's talk about how to collect. And this is pretty easy from time to time. So we observe. This is the simplest way. What are some of the things that the audience has said? What are some of the things that the audience has identified with? What are some of the things that, people of your audiences, what are some of the beliefs that you've observed or some of the behaviors that you have observed from your audience? Can you use that? Also, research. What makes a good job applicant? Research. There are ways to research your audience. If you are speaking to a particular organization, you may research their website. Actually, a good idea to do for interviews. If you are talking to a sports organization, you may look up their website. You may even interview someone who is familiar or representative of that audience to get a better understanding. And you may even send out surveys like, do you agree that pineapple belongs on pizza? From 5 being the strongly agree to 1 being strongly disagree. And then that can help me because I could then get a lot of people answering the same questions in something that is quantifiable. But the big detriment is that someone could just do C, 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 C. Also, what it can do is it can paint a picture that isn't actually there. If a question is worded poorly, then the audience may think of something different and may answer in a wrong way. Now we move on to how to adapt to the audience. When we have those demographic attributes, be it age, gender, religion, race, this information, we want to use this information to develop good supporting materials and examples. This means not to use culture-specific references. For example, if I'm in the South, I'm not going to say, "Oh yeah, I totally had fried chicken." I don't know. I don't know a lot about the South, but instead focusing on specific examples surrounding their experience and supporting material, that way it can be more relevant to them. Also use proper language for that audience. Avoid stereotyping and pandering. Also, adapt based on the audience's relationship to your topic. This influences your topic selection. You want to choose a topic that the audience cares about, but also something that you care about. Also, this may alter your specific purpose. If your purpose is to change the audience's mind, but the audience really doesn't agree with you, you may alter that purpose to instead make them think about this topic more. And we could even alter the complexity of the topic. If we're talking to third graders versus college students, that will change the complexity of the topic. And we have audience, and lastly, some more audience adaptation, adapting to the speaking situation. This involves some logistics, presentation technology. How loud do I have to talk to speak to the last person in the audience? Will I have a mic? Will I not have a mic? Also, we should always look the part. Dress slightly better than the audience. Arrive early. This communicates a ton because obviously in a classroom like this probably isn't as big of an issue, but in person, it is very tough for someone to restore their credibility if they come in, speeches have already started, they come in frazzled, late, and then they have to go in like 2 minutes, and then they're like, okay, yeah, I guess now I'm ready. That communicates credibility, and arriving late instead of arriving early, that can affect someone's ethos before they've even started speaking. And lastly, choose the right speaking style for the audience. Some audiences are more affected by certain speaking styles. A good example of this was back in the civil rights movement in the 60s. A lot of African American people who were civil rights leaders, they decided to, they used a more of like the speech of a pastor, because a lot of the leaders of those of that culture at the time were religious leaders, and as a result they were more influenced by that certain speaking style. But in the same way, our audience is going to require a different speaking style because we are on Zoom. And lastly, meeting and exceeding audience expectations. So we want to be sure that we're taking questions to make sure that our expectations are met. And when should we customize our speech to our audience? We should always be sure that we are finding ways to do this. And so the benefits, this is going to be pretty obvious, but I'll say them anyway. When we do adapt to the audience, it maintains high levels of interest in the speech. The audience will actually care, because if you have ever heard something that is not relevant to you, we tend to tune out. That is natural. Audiences are naturally egocentric, caring about what it means for them. Also, you will achieve your speech goals and be able to adapt those speech goals when necessary. Also, meeting the audience's expectations. Their expectations will be met. That way they will not be wondering why you haven't said this one part. A good example of this actually is a student of mine talked about, did a speech on vacation spots in Mexico. But before they jumped into it, they talked about how they would not be discussing beaches because beaches overall across the world tend not to change. So instead, focusing on the Mexico experience. Also handle adversarial audiences or audiences that are against you. The reason why this helps is because you better identify with that adversarial audience and therefore find ways to identify with them. And lastly, avoid embarrassing remarks, things that the audience may not that may diminish your credibility with that audience. So there are a lot of benefits of audience analysis, and we will find ways to engage with this for our informative and persuasive speech. But as of now, have a great rest of your day. I will see you all next time.